When we were interviewing Judith, she shared, there was a man who had a list of people that were to be collected and killed, but we forgave him.
The Burundi 1972 Genocide Commemoration Conference in Toronto, Canada.
Let's go next to our presenter, Colette Ruscheinsky. A few words about Colette. Colette, she was not born in Burundi, but she became slowly a friend of Burundi. She almost speaks Kirundi as she understands Dr. Janina as well. So she is a very good educator, the oral historian, a strong advocate for storytelling as a tool for justice, healing, and education. The background as education, he has a bachelor in administration. And Colette, with an oral historian, activist with the genocide and the human rights research in Africa and the diaspora. She works also for Doha, which is the digital oral history archive. And she preserved the survival testimonies about what was happened in Burundi and in Africa around the world. So please help me to welcome Colette as a friend of Burundi and the presenter.
Thank you so much for that. I'm very passionate to be here with all of you today. I've had the pleasure of visiting Burundi twice, and I'm so grateful to see all of you, so thank you. I'd like to get started by quickly mentioning how important stories are, because stories shape identity, memory, and belonging. And they are how individuals come to understand not only who they are, but where they come from. However, in the aftermath of mass atrocities and violence, stories are often not shared, but rather silenced. For more than 50 years, the survivors of the 1972 genocide of Burundi against the Hutu were unable to speak openly. Their memories dangerous, grief unbearable, and the stories lived not in public, but in their hearts and in their minds. Before we get started, I wanted to center all of you in a Kirundi proverb that I'm sure I'm going to mispronounce, but I hope you can. Oh yes, if you wouldn't mind, just next slide. Thank you, I'm sorry. Really quickly, these are all the different areas that we were able to gather testimonies. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a Kirundi proverb that, forgive me, Uja gukira ingwa ariya. Thank you. And as Dr. Janine was working with me through that, she explained that the best translation is that one has to talk about disease in order to heal from it. But what happens when you're forbidden to talk? So today I want to explore how trauma from the 1972 genocide of Burundi against the Hutu is carried across generations. And that happens through this forced silence and lived experience. But before I continue, I'd like to share a little bit more about myself. You see, before I did this, I was a journalist at heart. And I have several years of television production experience. So when I met Dr. Teregeza, I felt like I was prepared to do this work. I had seen trauma. I had seen accidents and death and loss. I was not prepared at all. And in that moment, I realized something. What happens when following the rules of journalism feels incredibly inhumane? What happens when removing your feelings and thoughts from the story actually becomes reckless? And that is when I decided that I had to stop being a journalist and remember the humanity of it. And so I would like to introduce you to somebody that I met in Burundi that showed me the light when I was in my darkest time. Next slide, please. I'd like you to meet Dominique. Dominique was a young shepherd during the 1972 violence. And he watched his family, friends get massacred, and he carried this memory in silence for decades. Encountering his testimony and standing on the land shifted my role from observer to witness. And what am I supposed to do now? Now that I have this data, which is actually a pile of human remains that has been buried beneath the earth for 50 years. My only relief from this was to turn to poetry. And so I would like to share with you a brief poem about Dominique entitled The Unsilenced Shepherd. A young shepherd hid behind a tree-lined mountain and watched tractors unload dead bodies into a hole outside of Gitega. Shaking with fear, he saw this pattern of terror repeat day after day. Then, to his horror, he became witness to something worse. The young shepherd saw the people on the tractors were actually still alive. Soldiers lined up their victims in groups of 10, bundling them as if they were firewood, binding them with rope. 10 prisoners wrapped in blood-drenched rope, tied by whatever remaining appendages they had left, only to be thrown into a pile of humans. Sometimes the victims were shot, sometimes they were sliced, stabbed, sometimes they were thrown in while they were still breathing. And every time they died on top of their neighbors, their brothers, their teachers, their pastors. For more than 50 years after the killings, the young shepherd could do absolutely nothing. But he knew that his story and these survivors needed protection. And so the young shepherd grew into a respectful man, a man who finally broke his silence. This brave soul led the Truth and Reconciliation Committee exactly to the spot where he saw his family get slaughtered. With confidence in his words and unbearable pain in his heart, he told the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, if you do not find any bones in this very spot, I will surrender my life to you, right here. The Unsilenced Shepherd released his story, and with that, he released the discovery of 5 mass graves. Now, the Unsilenced Shepherd is memorializing this land by planting trees where each person took their last breath. And each tree is strong, sturdy, resilient. It can stand the test of time. It can survive in dark, destitute conditions, because these trees are like the people of Burundi. They mark the earth with strength, and they stand tall, ready to protect their land and their people. Because the Unsilenced Shepherd knows that by releasing his voice, he released the souls of others. And now this Unsilenced Shepherd knows that the only way to protect future flocks from the same demise is to break silence. It's important that I tell you that this is more than just poetry, because it's actually a testimony that we gathered at the Genocide Human Rights Research Center. You see, years later, when the Unsilenced Shepherd went back to the site, he helped find those humans. And unfortunately, we realized that this is not an isolated incident. And so we began gathering more and more survivor testimonies to create a digital oral history archive. And as the archivist, I'm extremely honored to share just a few testimonies from our GRAD Center. Next slide, please. So, as part of the Genocide Research Center, we like to conduct research by gathering testimonies through documentation. And then we, in addition to documenting it on the Oral History Archive, we've also taken our stories through photography exhibition, in which we feature the survivors in a very dignified way, and we also are able to share their stories. Next slide, please. So as of right now, our digital oral history, we have gathered more than 200 survivor testimonies. And at this time, there's 90 testimonies published. And according to our specs or numbers, we've had 1,300 streams of watching our videos and over 3,400 interactions. Next slide, please. So because silence breeds hurt and unresolved trauma, I wanted to feature just a few stories that we learned about during our travels. And I'd like to introduce you to Marceline. Marceline was only 8 years old when her entire life changed permanently. She first learned that her 2 older brothers had been killed. And as the violence escalated, she then lost her parents, her siblings, her stability, and her home. With no one left to care for her, she was forced to abandon education and focus on survival. She walked long distances to gather plants so she could sell them, and was forced to navigate a world that no longer resembled her childhood. When we interviewed Marceline about her experience, she said, "We cried for a long time, but there was nothing we could do, so we stopped." What happens to a person that has to stop crying and carry that heart in their heart? Well, there's tons of research, as I'm sure you all know, regarding the effects of trauma, and it explains that overwhelming trauma, particularly in childhood, can impair emotional processing and lead to long-term detrimental emotional issues. Marceline's unresolved trauma reshaped both her emotional development and her life opportunities. This impacts her socioeconomics and emotional health. Next slide, please. I'd like you guys to take a moment to meet Judith. Judith describes Burundi as once a peaceful place where neighbors supported one another. Then that reality was shattered when soldiers arrived simply with a list of names. People were taken from their homes, forced to dig their own graves, and then executed. And after their deaths, their homes were looted, communities fractured. Judith lost her father, her husband, and her brother-in-law. Decades later, she reflects not only on what was lost, but what also remains unresolved. When we were interviewing Judith, she shared, "There was a man who had a list of people that were to be collected and killed, but we forgave him." The breakdown of trust, combined with the coexistence of forgiveness and unresolved grief. What do people do with that? There's a moral obligation, but there's also a need for healing. And there's an ongoing concern about reconciliation. Judith's testimony demonstrates that unresolved trauma continues to affect relationships and the community across time. Next slide, please. And finally, I'd like to introduce you to Pimako. He described his childhood with a sudden loss and instability. His father was taken and killed, and his family structure collapsed. What followed was not only grief, but displacement, insecurity, and a loss of what once he defined as home. The genocide stripped families of their land, their property, their stability, and their leaving lasting efforts on daily life. When we interviewed him, he shared, "We lived like orphans. We became like people who had lost everything." The loss of family and structure and protection is extremely traumatizing. And the long-term socioeconomic consequences of this are detrimental. Global research shows that unresolved trauma is linked to long-term economic instability, including disrupted education, loss of opportunity, and reduced life outcomes. His experience demonstrates how unresolved trauma reshapes both identity and long-term socioeconomic conditions. It's important to remember that these are not isolated experiences. They are reoccurring, unresolved trauma patterns with lasting psychological effects. Next slide, please. In conclusion, the digital oral history archive that we've created at Northeastern Illinois is more than an archive. It is a space where stories return and are carried forward. Because storytelling has never been individual, it has always been communal. Through stories of Marceline, we saw how trauma disrupts childhood and emotional development. And Judith showed us how it can reshape communities. Pamako showed us that in life, there's so much more than death. The Doha and these testimonies are evidence that unresolved trauma continues, and that is why testimony matters. Because when survivors speak, they do not just preserve the past, but they begin to change what the future generations carry. Thank you.